Channel 38, in cooperation with the Greater Chicago Sunday School Association, presents Adventures in Learning. The Bible will spring to life in this special series on archaeology. And now, here's your host on Adventures in Learning, Rose Van Reken.
Hello again, and welcome to our fifth lesson in the series which is called Archaeology and Everyday Life in Bible Times. You will remember that when we spoke about tells, which we said were layer cakes of dead cities, that we sometimes mentioned how many cities were built on top of each other in layers, each one building on the ruins of the city before. Sometimes there were 5, sometimes there were 20. Maybe you wondered, how do they know that there is a new city? And how do they know the age of the level of the city on which an archaeologist is digging? Well, there are several ways that archaeologists can tell. One is by the masonry. People built their houses in different ways all through the centuries. For instance, Herod used very large cut stones. In other places, they used smaller stones and fitted little ones in between. So masonry is one way that they can tell. Sometimes coins are found. And if they do have, as they did after Alexander the Great, if they have the image of the emperor, then one is able to tell in what period that coin was minted. And that is one of the indications of the age of the level of the mound. Besides that, they can also find seals. If you find a seal, which is the seal of a person who we know existed at a certain date, then we can tell perhaps that particular level was there when he was living. Sometimes events are written up. And if they are written up and they're put on pottery, on the clay, and the clay has not disintegrated and they're able to read the event, then they can tell what age that particular level is. Another one is through carbon-14. But the most popular and the most accurate way of determining what age a certain level of occupation is through pottery. You see, pottery is found in abundance. Every single tell that is dug affords much pottery, some whole pieces and some fragments. And Pottery and others were able to determine by listing the pottery as they found it in the different layers of the tells and comparing it with other tells and seeing how the pottery was found in their layers, they were able to determine a calendar by which they could know what years were covered by a certain level. Would you believe that pottery experts are so fine that they can tell when they look at a jar within 50 years when that particular jar was made and also where it was found? Many of these receptacles are in splendid state of preservation. They have been found in all parts of the inhabited world, and they are really the secret to the age of each level on a tell. Styles, you see, have changed. You know that clothing styles change, house furnishing styles change, weapons change, but all of these have disappeared. Only pottery has remained. And because of that, because pottery has stayed, pottery is the one thing they can use. Nelson Glick has said that glass breaks and decays, wood rots and disappears, stone crumbles, metal rusts or corrodes, cloth disintegrates. Only pottery lasts. Before people used pottery, they may have used baskets. But there were some things that were not good about baskets because they could not hold liquids, and baskets were subject to rodents. That's not true of pottery. Let's think about how pottery is prepared. It's found all over the world. First, they knead the clay. Clay is found everywhere. Sometimes they add sand or straw or gravel to the clay. If they add these ingredients, there is sometimes less shrinking. The drying is more even. There is less chance of cracking if those particular ingredients are added. And also during the time of baking. If they bake it, the water disappears. And oftentimes, when they do fire it, they usually put it upside down, as you may have noticed. And so there's often a black rim around around really the top of the pot. And then as far as the shaping is concerned, that varied from age to age. Sometimes there was direct shaping with the hands. Sometimes they made a coil and they wound it round and round and round. Later on, the pottery wheel was developed. And when they used the pottery wheel, they were able to make much more uniform pottery. Also, they had the molds that they used, molds which were either baskets or gourds. Sometimes they would mold things on the outsides of the baskets. Sometimes they would press things inside the baskets or the gourds. They tell me that the Indians in New Mexico still use gourds often for the bottom part of their pottery when they make it, and then they mold the top part by hand. Also, in the first days, pottery was not fired, but in the later days, they fired the pottery. And that was a good thing to do because it made the pottery still more durable. It revealed the flaws. It showed also if there were air bubbles. It showed if there were holes, if someone made a coiled pot and there were little holes that wasn't connected quite right, the firing would show that. But otherwise, pots that are baked are indestructible. In fact, really, all pottery is indestructible, and that's why it's so terribly important as a calendar for the archaeologist. And then another difference that came about was in the decoration. In the painting that they would do, sometimes before, sometimes after firing, or the glazing, or the slipping. Besides that, there were many kinds of jars made of pots. There were pots that were used for different purposes. They were used to hold liquids, large pots to hold liquids. Some, we read in the Bible even, were used to hold salt. Some were smaller juglets that might be used to hold perfume. There were those that were used in the raising of bread, for deep frying, for eating, for holding charcoal. They were used for wash basins, and they were used for storage. I have seen large pots this size that have been put in graves with people, sometimes 12, 15 pots. And these pots would hold olive oil or wine or grain because they felt that the person who died could use it in his future life. Also, from clay, they made seals, they made lamps, spindles, weights, canteens, jewelry, and of course, from clay, they made bricks. They made bricks for their homes, for the walls. They made bricks for the floors. And so pottery, so clay was used very, very much. And of course, when a potter was working, sometimes he would make a pot which didn't suit his purposes. And so then he would have to break it and start over. We even read about that, don't we, in Jeremiah? I have here a passage from Jeremiah where God tells Jeremiah to go to the potter's house. It's in the 18th chapter. And he says, watch him make a pot. The potter was working with a potter's wheel, and the pot was imperfect. So the potter formed it into another pot. And God said, O Israel, like clay in the hands of the potter, so are you in my hands. Can I not do with you as this potter does? And in chapter 19, God tells Jeremiah to take a pot, a clay jar, with some elders and priests and go to the potsherd gate. It's interesting they should call it the potsherd gate. It must mean that there were lots of pieces of pottery, which they call potsherds, so many that when they threw them out of that gate, the gate got the name from all the potsherds that were outside. And after speaking to those people the message of God at the potsherd gate, God said to him, break that clay jar while the people are watching and say, this is what the Lord God Almighty says. I will smash this nation and this city just as this potter's jar is smashed and cannot be repaired. You remember too that Job, when he had his terrible sickness, sat outside and used a potsherd, a piece of pottery, in order to scratch himself, to scrape himself because he was in such trouble. Also, we read in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 14, It will break in pieces like pottery, shattered so mercilessly that among its pieces not a fragment will be found for taking coals from a hearth or from scooping water out of a cistern. So we know those were two things that the people did when they worked with the pottery pieces. They could take coals from the hearth with it, or they could use it to get water out of a cistern. There's another thing they used it for. They used them in schools. They used them for the children to practice writing on some of the pottery sherds. Pottery is the calendar then to the archaeologist. I would like to show you a few slides which indicate the difference in the pottery as the centuries went on. This particular group of pots is over 3,000 years old. They have flat bases. They have a simple flaring rim. They do have some ledge handles, sometimes on the wide part of the body, or small loop handles on the shoulder. They have glossy red burnished decoration covering the entire body often, a flat red and brown painted pattern. That square receptacle that you see is an incense burner. Here we have those that are 2,000 years old. You can see the style has changed a bit. These are much more barrel-shaped. They're greenish gray. The handles are rare, and in the front you can just about make up a four-spouted lamp, which first comes in this particular time in history. Here we have a beautiful pot from Tel Dan. It's not Canaanite. It's most likely from the Aegean Sea area. Maybe they had trade between the Mycenaeans, who had luxury items like aromatic oils with beautiful fragrances, and exchanged them with the Canaanites, who had wine and grain and ordinary olive oil that they could send for these particular beautiful products that the Mycenaeans had. And then we have the Iron Age pottery. Here we see a pilgrim flask in the front, and the designs that were made at the time of the Iron Age. There's a canteen in the front. And here we see the Philistine pottery, which was very geometric in design. They had diamonds and chevrons and concentric circles. They had stylized figures, as you see that bird in the front. And usually they had black and white, black and red, and it was on a white background. And this next slide shows us what pottery looked like in the days of David and Solomon. In this period, Israel's pottery was very, very plain. And you will notice that there are parts there. In the back is a large jug. There's a juglet to the right and in the front, and a bowl in the background, and a lamp in the foreground. This is not good pottery. It's really rather clumsy in a way. It was not nearly as good as the Canaanite pottery was before the children of Israel came into the country. I've moved over to my table. I have here some pottery which I would like to show you. You remember the very last picture that we saw, which was the pottery that was from the time of King David? Well, I have some pottery here which is also from the time of King David. This is a juglet. It is about 3,000 years old. It is the actual juglet that came from King David's time. It has a round bottom so that it cannot stand, but it can easily pour liquids. Here we have a bowl. This bowl was used by the people, perhaps to hold food, and perhaps they ate from that bowl. People didn't use flat plates until very recently to hold their food. So this could have been something which people used when they ate. And here we have a lamp. This lamp also is from King David's time. The inside was filled with olive oil, and then a flax wick was used to lay over this little pinched rim, which is here. The flax wick would extend and the fire would be out here. You know, they did not find very many lamps in most of the homes in Israel. Most likely, the people did not use a lot of lamps. I remember when some people from Africa visited us, and I asked them what they found most different about our country. And they said, the fact that you people get up so long after it's light and you go to bed so long after it's dark. And I thought to myself, that makes sense. Perhaps they are thinking we could save a lot of electricity if we'd get up when the sun did and go to bed when the sun did, which is perhaps what the people in the olden ages did. And that's why they did not need so many lamps. When you read, by the way, in Proverbs 31 about the virtuous woman and that her lamp did not go out at night, that doesn't mean that she worked all night. She could never have done all she did, working all day and then working all night. That's not even humanly possible. But what it does mean is these wicks had to be trimmed. And so she would get up at night and she would trim the wick so that it would stay lit. That's why she got up at night. That's why the lamp did not go out at night. I think I will show you a few of these first. I told you that pottery experts can tell within 50 years how old a pot is, back to 2,500 years BC. But I want to show you that you can do just a little bit of that yourself. If I were to show you this bowl, you looking at it would say, I know, that bowl comes from the Orient, perhaps from China. And you're right. This bowl is porcelain. It does come from China, and it's about 400 years old. If I showed you this, you would look at it and you would say, Europe, I bet, perhaps the Netherlands. Could be Delft? And I would say, you're right. That's what it is, a Delft picture. If I showed you this, you would say, Indian pottery, Southwest United States. You see, you know something about pottery too. And I would say, you're right. And that's where we bought it, a beautiful pot. Now, if I showed you this one and you looked at it, you might say, well, I don't know where that one comes from. Looks like someone had pottery for a hobby. And you're right. This is made by someone who's been taking pottery, studied it, and has made something as beautiful as this. It's not really from any particular area. But when you look at these other things that I have here on the table, you will soon know that they are different in styles. I think that perhaps the most famous style that I have seen is this. Now, this is a miniature and it's a replica, okay? The real ones are usually much, much larger. They might be 2 feet tall, but these are the kinds that the people used for storage. They stored their olive oil in them, and they stored their wine, and they stored their grain. They would cover the mouth with a piece of cloth and tie a string around that, and then put a seal on it. Some other day I'll give you a lesson on seals, and we'll talk about that. You see, there are all different styles. You can have the long-necked one with the wider mouth, or you can have the narrow-necked one with a narrow mouth. Each of these are miniatures, remember, and these are replicas. These are not originals. This kind of a jar is the kind that they used to put documents in. They would put the document inside, and they would seal it with the cover. They would put a wax molding over it, and that was how they would preserve it. Or they would put a string over it and then put the wax on the sides and hold it in place. This is like the Dead Sea Scroll jars, you remember. I picked this up in Israel this summer. It's sort of a composite of all the different shapes of pottery that were made in Israel, so that you can see from the large jug in the background to the small jug to these tiny little jugs, each one of them with its own shape and each one with its own use. One of my most treasured possessions is this little juglet. You won't believe it, will you? But this little thing is 4,000 years old. Most likely it was saved to use for a special ointment. But this was dug up by one of the archaeologists, and I was very, very happy when I was able to obtain it. This tiny little thing, 4,000 years old. I wish each one of you could touch it. Now I would like to tell you just a little bit more about the lamps. You see, this big lamp that I talked to you about is the lamp that was from David's day. But after that, lamps became smaller. And so we have these, which are really imitations. These are all imitations. These are not real. You can buy these. If you go to Israel and you look for them, you can buy these for maybe 50 cents because they're not expensive at all, because they're copies of former lamps. The oil went inside, the wick comes outside, and that's how it burns. And remember, they burned olive oil. Lots and lots of olive trees in Israel, olive presses, and they've had the work of the olive trees all the way, the work of the olive oil. They used it a lot. They used it for medicine. They used it for cooking. They used it for lighting, for many things. Now, I also have 4 lamps which are from Jesus' day originals. They belong to a friend of mine named Reverend Jackman. He got these by working with archaeologists in Israel. And these are real lamps which are something like those that would have been used by the virgins, you know, in the parable that Jesus told, or also in the story he told about the lady who lost the coin and she lit a lamp so she could look around to her house. She would have a little lamp like this. Now, one of the things that tells archaeologists how old something is the design that they find on the particular piece of pottery. And I have lots of little potsherds that I have picked up. And I hope that the cameras will be able to pick up how small and pretty some of these designs are. Here you see one that is sort of a feather design. Can you see how it's this way and this way, how they made the marks? Now, that was only done in one particular period. Sometimes they used this kind. See all these circles which were made around the pot? These are all different. Some are small and some are large. Here you see a whole group of them, and this was the design. Now, that again was only used at a certain period in history, which an archaeologist would know about, especially one who's a pottery expert. I told you that sometimes they could make pottery pieces by putting them in baskets. I have a sneaking suspicion that these two might have been made by using a basket as a mold. You can scarcely see, but there is just a very small, faint design which looks a little bit like it could have come from a basket. Then we have a square. Look at this. They made a square design on this one. Here was quite a large pot, and it just had a little design, circles, and then a little small design on this side. And the material is different. You can see that this material is quite different from this material. I have a confession to make. These came from our son who lives in Liberia, and when he was digging in his backyard, he found these. So these are really African potsherds, but you notice how very definite the design is and how thick the pottery is. You see that? And here I have 2 little rims. These are, one is very thin and one is thicker. They are just the rims of a pot. They're also made from a whiter material. And as I said before, that's all important to the archaeologist who's a pottery specialist. The Bible tells us this is a flask, by the way. This is a canteen, which they could have used to carry water in when they went on a trip like we would, okay? Here is a big pot that I forgot to show you. This big pot I just picked it up for a few dollars, and I must confess that it fell and a part of it is broken, see? But at least you can get an idea of what the pots look like and the type of clay. When I was thinking about pottery, I couldn't help but think about what God has written to us about pottery in the Bible and how sometimes God likens himself to the great potter. Have you thought of it that he says, Everyone who is called by not my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made. God was the great potter. Again, we read, yet, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay. You are the potter. We are all the work of your hand. Another in Psalm 100 we read, know ye not that the Lord, he is God? It is he that hath made us, and we are his. Isaiah 10:8 and 9 says, your hands shaped me and made me. Will you now turn and destroy me? Remember that you molded me like clay. Will you now turn me to dust again? There is a thing that I read in Ecclesiasticus. I don't know if you have ever read that book, but in chapter 38, verse 29, we read a story about a potter, and it says, so it is with the potter sitting at his work, turning the wheel with his feet, always engrossed in the task of making up his tally. He molds the clay with his arm, crouching forward to apply his strength. He concentrates on finishing the glazing and stays awake to clean out the furnace. And from Alfred Dennis Godley, we get this, for 'tis not verse, 'tis not prose, but earthenware alone it is that ultimately shows what men have thought and done. Let us remember it is God who has made us, and we are his.